Great. A Peacemaker's Guide to Navigating Misinformation, Polarization in the Election. So these are probably words you've heard thrown out a lot: misinformation, polarization, and of course we have the upcoming election in just under 2 months, right? And so these first two things will probably intensify in the coming months. And so my goal in this presentation is to try to identify and characterize what is meant by polarization, what is meant by misinformation, how do we see it playing out right now, and then maybe try to begin to offer a few biblical principles that can help us to effectively navigate it. Although I'm also super excited, interested in hearing what you will come up with in your small groups, thinking about what are some additional principles and challenges in this political moment. So as we go through this, you can be thinking about what is some of the challenges that maybe I failed to identify and how we might respond to those. Okay, so when we talk about polarization, I have this little graphic here, and so on the blue it represents Democrats and their views, and so not all Democrats are the same. Some maybe have consistently liberal views, some mostly liberal, many have a mixed view, some more conservative, and same thing with Republicans in the red. And so you have the two groups, and it's indicating their views over time. But notice what happens. If we start in 1994, there's a whole lot of overlap, a ton of overlap. So in 1994, it's about 2/3 overlap. But something starts happening, particularly as you get into like 2008 and onward. There starts being this spreading across. And so now the typical Democrat is further to the left, the typical Republican further to the right. And so this is what I mean by polarization. Rather than the two coming closer together, what it means to be Republican and Democrat, there's less overlap between the two, between those on the political left and political right. And so here's a little more data on this. In 1994, if you looked at the typical Democrat, they were more liberal than 64% of Republicans. And that makes sense, like you would expect that, but that still means there's a 1/3 overlap, right? So 1/3 of Republicans would have views that are more liberal than the typical Democrat, and same vice versa, that he's the typical Republican, and they are more conservative than 70% of Democrats, but that still means 1/3 of Democrats are pretty conservative. And so what that means is there's a really significant overlap, right? There's a lot of rather liberal Republicans and a lot of rather conservative Democrats. But as you see, as we move now into the 2010s, 2014, that overlap has diminished extremely. And so now the typical Democrat is more liberal than over 90% of Republicans, and the typical Republican is more conservative than over 90% of Democrats. So this is based on a political survey where they ask individuals their views on a series of issues to try to assess if they have consistently conservative or consistently liberal moves. So one way to describe this is there's a purification of the parties taking place, where if you're going to be a Republican, you're going to be a Republican entirely, right? If you're going to be a Democrat, you're going to be a Democrat entirely. We have these purity tests that come into being. And so it's becoming more difficult for individuals to hold to perhaps mixed views within a party. And we've even seen that with some particular high-profile instances of individuals coming out and changing their party because they were no longer able to hold their position within their party. Okay, so that's one way to look at polarization. I have one more here. There's another aspect of this, and that is how individuals view those in the other party. And so it's never that the two parties have been particularly fond of each other, but you might ask a question like, is the other party not only untasteful, and maybe don't only disagree with them, but do you think they pose a threat to the nation's well-being, right? And we see that over time, these numbers have been increasing. So the Republicans are more likely to see Democrats as a threat to the nation's well-being, and Democrats are more likely to see Republicans as a threat to the nation's well-being. And so this data goes over 2014. You can think well, what's happened in the last 6 years? Have these numbers suddenly dropped back down? No, not at all. Like, I think it's pretty obvious that from the current political rhetoric, that this has just been dialed up and intensified even more. And so here's two instances of our current campaign season. So when Bloomberg came out and started his campaign, he referred to Trump as an existential threat. And those were pretty common types of rhetoric that were used in the Democratic primary and now in the Democratic race against Trump. But on the opposite side, you have a similar thing where there's been a lot of ads from the Trump campaign that have been painting Joe Biden as not safe for America, right? Images of his face superimposed over the various protests and riots. And so you have on both sides this very strong language that the other side poses some kind of existential threat to our nations. Not just that we disagree on tax policy or we disagree on some issues of foreign policy, but if the other is elected, it could end our nation for good, right? So this is what I mean by polarization. So what do we do? How do we respond to polarization? And I think there are maybe two principles I'll begin to highlight. The first is we should recognize it's really dangerous, right? So Jesus makes the point in Matthew that a kingdom divided against itself will not stand, is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself will not stand. You would expect in political discourse there will be some tensions that pull us apart from each other, that okay, we don't quite agree. And that's fine as long as there are stronger forces that bring us back together, right? So as long as there are common forces uniting us that are stronger than the forces that are pulling us apart, we can sustain this. But if we're getting to the place where we view the other party as not just one having a difference of opinion, but as one who is fundamentally a threat to a national security, one who's an existential threat, this doesn't bode well for our for our democracy and the future of our country. Now that's not to say that there's nothing perhaps valid about some of these critiques. Maybe you resonate with some of these concerns, and we are in a unique political moment right now. But I'm just trying to step back and think, if we continue down this path for the next 5, 10, 15 years, it's very hard to it's a very concerning trajectory given the warning of Jesus in Matthew 12. And of course, this is a warning that Abraham Lincoln echoed in the context of the Civil War, right? So you can think of some echoes of that. But the second thing I would encourage us to keep in mind as we think through some of these issues from a biblical perspective is that we should reject fear-based appeals. So it's explicitly told in John's epistle, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. And I think this is a great principle for the Christian life and how one thinks about and relates to God. But I think it also is probably indicative of one's political life. If you're being driven primarily by fear, there probably is something there that you need to examine, because we are to be driven by an ethic of love, right? And so those are two principles that might begin to help us think about polarization, our response to it. But what feeds polarization? Why is it happening? And for that, I want to talk a little bit about media. So over the last several decades, we've had a proliferation of media sources. If you think back to like the 1950s or 60s or 70s, there's not that many options for where one gets their news, right? You can tune into one of the big 4 networks, you can watch the nightly news show, and that's where you get your news. And then comes the 90s, and we start having the introduction of the internet in the typical American home. And when this was happening in the 90s, even early 2000s, there was a lot of excitement about the democratization of knowledge. That now suddenly, 2 things were hoped would happen. The first is everyone would have access to high quality information. America would become much more informed. The global community would be much more informed. We'll have much more substantial and nuanced views on topics. And the second is we'll be brought into conversation with each other, with people not like us. And this will help us get these robust understandings of topics, perhaps greater empathy, greater connection with those of various worldviews. And so that was the great hope of the internet. It would connect us with each other and credible information in some fantastic ways. But you listen to that story now, and you're like, well, that didn't happen. Like that's not the case. So here's one way of thinking about the effect of the proliferation of news sources that came with the rise of the internet and then the advent of social media. So the nightly news hour gets replaced with 24/7 reporting. I mean, this is even before this with the rise of cable news, right? C-SPAN, but then like Fox News, CNN, these kinds of 24/7 news shows. And maybe there's some really great stuff about 24/7 reporting. You can have instant access to news as it's happening. But there's a few perhaps downsides. One is you don't have the same kind of preparatory time. So you don't have the same amount of time to verify the facts of a story, to get the full context and framing. There's a demand that we need to report it now, because if we don't report it right now, the competition will, and we can't have them beat us to the scoop. And so there's pressure to report things perhaps with less full understanding of the context and being able to verify it. And also then 24 hours is just a really long time to report news compared to 1 hour. And so that time starts getting filled up with all kinds of things, pseudo news or opinion or various pundits, and perhaps then the line between news and opinion begins to get blurred. So a few more aspects of this. When you have few news outlets serving a broad audience, they have to be trying to appeal to a broad audience. And so they can't be turning off, half their audience. And so there was a great desire for politically neutral content, right? You can't, and this isn't just the case of news. You can think of TV shows as well. Shows back when there were just a few outlets were pretty vanilla, pretty generic. Things try to appeal to the masses. And now with the rise of like Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime, you have these really niche genres and really niche shows being produced for a real niche audience. And maybe you've benefited from that. Maybe you have a really particular interest and you can find some shows that, a very small percentage of the population would like, but we're able to do this now to so many different shows being produced. Well, it's the same thing with news. When you have numerous news outlets, no longer are they competing for a broad audience, they're competing for a niche audience. And so they need to tailor their content for that niche audience. So they have an incentive just from their business model to be tailoring for a niche audience. And so we often think of things like Fox News competing with CNN, and that's not quite right. It's more like CNN is competing with MSNBC, and Fox News is competing with, the Breitbarts or whatever. So it's those who lean left competing with other ones that lean left, those who lean right competing with other programs that lean right, and then that's going to push their reporting further to the left or the right. Now, I think some of these news channels do a better job than others of preventing that and fighting against that instinct, but there are built-in incentives to do this. And then so you have some other effects. One is you have these handful of trusted institutions, and so there's a big emphasis on the journalistic integrity. But now you have to compete with like BuzzFeed and these little guy in his basement or whatever, and so you get a lot of bad actors introduced into the news ecosystem. And in addition to that, there's just been generally in American life an erosion of institutional trust, not just in news institutions, but in all kinds of institutions over the last couple of decades. And we can talk about some of the reasons for why that is. And then the last one is, if you're competing for attention, you need your reporting to be attention grabbing. So in the 1990s, you had the rise of like outrage news. And so there was some, particularly, I think it probably started on the right with some conservative talk show hosts and others who had outrage style, but then it's been mirrored on the left. So you get people's attention by having constant outrage in your reporting. And contrast that with when you're appealing to a broad audience, you attempt to have this dispassionate reporting, almost dull and boring, right? Like the news was supposed to be boring back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And now it's become something trying to compete with all of the other news sources to get content, to get user engagement. So you can see how this plays out in the life in the context of democracy, where different voters turn to different news sources. So here was a poll of looking at Trump voters and Clinton voters from the 2016 election and seeing what news sources they depended upon. And there's some pretty notable disparities, Fox in particular leading the way with Trump voters, but you also see sources overrepresented with Clinton voters like CNN or MSNBC in particular, and others, NPR, etc. And so this introduces the idea that many have referred to as an echo chamber, that we have sources on the left speaking to those on the left and sources on the right speaking to those on the right. Here's a picture of what echo chambers look like in action. So this is a model of Twitter dialogue. The blue are conservative stories being shared that perhaps reinforce conservative narratives, and the red are some the red are conservative stories being shared reinforcing conservative narratives, and the blue are liberal or left-leaning stories reinforcing liberal narratives. And you can see there's a lot of conversation between the red and itself and the blue in itself, but very little meaningful interaction between the red and the blue. So you can look at things like retweeting or commenting on other posts, and you see that the news stories get shared within the red ecosystem, but hardly break into the blue, and vice versa. And so it's almost like you have two different realities that the two groups are living within. So here's another analysis of this. So I really like this one. This paper is a little bit technical, but it's really fun what they do. So they create these contour maps where they color the intensity based on the views of the neighbors closest to that person. So on social media, you look at, okay, who are the people in this individual's group, and do they have views similar to themselves? And they see on these divisive issues like Obamacare, abortion, and gun control, that here you have those of one party, and the people closest to them have very much the same views, and same for those on the opposite party. So you get these, so I think these are the conservatives, and these are liberals. And you see both start getting these echo chambers being formed around them. So there have been some who try to combat some of this. Maybe you've probably seen this going around on social media, these attempts to classify various news sources and try to identify the political bias via skewing left or skewing right, and along with that classification, thinking through the different types of news reporting. So there's some that's just merely facts-based, or facts with very little analysis. There's others that have a lot of analysis. So let's think of an example. So I really like The Atlantic, for example, and they tend to have longer analysis pieces rather than merely just fact reporting, or something like The Economist or something. So that those are some that would still be fairly central. I mean, Atlantic tends to be a little more left on a lot of issues. The Economist probably would be a little more right. But then you have some that the analysis gives way to opinion, and then that opinion moves to just pure like propaganda, right? It's clearly trying to push a particular view on those watching or reading, or however they're engaging with the content. And so this might be concerning for a couple of reasons. So you have this proliferation of sources, but when you're somewhere like on Facebook, they're kind of all equalized, right? Someone shares a story, and you don't see its place in this little graph. And so it could be a story from, any of these less credible sources coming right up alongside the more credible ones. Now, recently Facebook has enacted some measures to try and fact-check fake news, right? So maybe you've seen this where someone shares a story, and Facebook has under it a little notification that this is not true, and it links you to a reliable source. But there are two shortcomings with this. I mean, I think that's probably, maybe that's a good measure. You can wonder if that is or not. Do we trust Facebook to be doing this kind of work or not? They partner with some reliable entities, but it's still a good question. But there are two shortcomings. One is, even if you're able to tease out the most extreme voices on like the bottom extremes of here. So maybe you're able to tease out some stories from here, and some stories from here. When you report the news, there's still a lot of room for narrative building, right? And so individuals are still able to create a narrative from a story that very much is one-sided, even if it's factual. So you can still be like, in some of these categories that are giving very clear narratives that are factually correct, but perhaps lack the full context, or lack this idea of balance in reporting. And the second difficulty is a lot of really thoughtful people, I think, have identified that we're not just experiencing the difficulty of echo chambers, but we're in now epistemological chambers, where individuals recognize that these other news sources exist on the other side, or vice versa, but they just discredit them. They say, well, anything from the New York Times has extreme liberal bias, and so we don't need to listen to them. Although generally the New York Times is a pretty reliable source. I think it's fine to recognize that maybe they have some biases, some blind spots, but you just discredit everything that comes from them. And so no matter what they're reporting on, you can just discredit it, and you only listen to your particular swath of trusted sources that are ones that reinforce and affirm some of your prior beliefs. So those are some difficulties, and people have been taking advantage of it. And so here are several ad campaigns that were created and promoted on Facebook in the last election by foreign actors or Russian agents that made stories to appeal to those on the left and to try to radicalize their views, try to intensify, and then same thing they did for the right. So they were playing both sides. They would pick an issue. So here's the issue of police brutality and racial justice, and they would try to create these extreme posts to radicalize those on both sides. And they did this for a variety of issues, abortion, etc., and intentionally created these stories that they knew would hit some of the flashpoints in American discourse. So what should our response be to this? So here are two biblical principles, and maybe this will just scratch the surface, but I'm excited for you guys to talk about and reflect a little bit further on how we might try to engage with the reality of misinformation. One is a principle from Proverbs I really like. The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. It's a beautiful proverb, but it just reminds us that something can be entirely compelling until we hear the other side of the account. And so I think it's really important for us to diversify our news sources. That's not to say we won't be perhaps sympathetic with some kinds of narratives or some news sources, but it's important for us to get a diversity of credible news sources that speak from a variety of perspectives. And so if you're someone who leans left on some particular issues, is there a voice on the right you can respect, who you can listen to and try to get a sense of their take on it, or vice versa? If you lean more right on some issues, is there a voice that tends to lean a little more left, but does so in a way that's credible, that you can respect? I think that's really important. The second principle is something that's found in Thessalonians, and so this is given in the context of the man of lawlessness. You have this apocalyptic take in 2 Thessalonians, but I think it's an important principle that applies here. And you see that in the end, those who perish will perish because they refuse to love the truth, and so be saved. And so they end up being facing a powerful delusion. They end up being deceived. They end up believing the lie, not just because they didn't know the truth, but because they didn't love the truth. And I think that's a really important point, that it's not just enough for us to say, I want to know true things, but there has to be a love of truth that animates us, so that when we're trying to understand the facts around something, we'll go to the extra work of, okay, let me not just find the view that agrees with my priors, but let me try to develop a robust understanding of this. Let me do some fact checking. Let me look at multiple credible sources. Maybe reverse image search when there's that image that seems, you know, just too good to be true to fit your particular narrative. You can see some of the fuller context around it. And so it's developing a love for truth that feeds into how then we come to see and understand the world around us. So here's a comic I really like, and I've identified with it at some points more than others. Are you coming to bed? I can't, this is important. What? Someone is wrong on the internet. And many of you perhaps, I don't know, have seen this happen on Facebook discussions, or maybe you've been that person yourself, thinking it's your job to purify the internet. And so I love how John speaks into this. So John's letters are some of the shortest parts of the New Testament. And so what's going on? Why are they so short? You know, like 2 John, it says chapter 1, but there's only one chapter. So some people just put the verse. So why are John's letters so short? And the reason is, he tells us at the end, he says, I have much to write to you. So it could have been a very long letter. You know, it could have been like the book of Luke or something, a much longer work. But he says, I don't want to use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to visit you and talk with you face to face so that our joy may be complete. And this just reminds me that sometimes when we're tempted to use our keypads or our thumbs, maybe we need to hold off and save some things for face-to-face conversations, because those can produce joy in a way where online conversations might just cause frustration and you know, anger. And yeah, okay. Last idea I want to hit on, and then we're going to move into our discussions. And the last idea is, this isn't just a phenomena that happens online. This isn't just something that has to do with like social media, but I think it actually plays out in our lives. So here we have two stores, and if you were to go to a Whole Foods store and interview or survey, you know, the political views of those in Whole Foods, you probably have a sense of what you would find. And same thing with a place like Cracker Barrel, right? Perhaps not entirely uniform, but it would skew pretty far either to the left or to the right. And I think this makes the point that our political identities are not just the views we hold that maybe we express on the internet or when someone asks us expressly about politics, but it's something that gets acted out in a lot of our lives, right? And so let me give another example of this. So Pew did an interesting study where they looked at the housing preferences of conservatives versus liberals. And they found them, they were very different. So liberals prefer communities where houses are smaller and close to each other, but that have within walking distance, you know, schools and stores and restaurants. So a much more cosmopolitan, a community-centered approach to living. Whereas those who identify as more conservative identified, and it was a significant difference. It was statistically significant. It was very significant. They prefer community where the houses are larger and further apart. So a big, you know, yard, large houses, but schools and stores and restaurants, you know, maybe it takes a bit of driving to get to them. And, you know, you might inherently prefer one to the other, but try and be sympathetic to the other one for a second. You know, if you think, wow, why do they need those big houses? Well, that can be a reflection of valuing big family get-togethers and, you know, wanting to have a big yard to play football and doing all kinds of great community-centered things as well. So a lot of emphasis on the family and community, where this is another type of community, the engaging with neighbors, maybe a smaller family, but having a robust sense of community with those you live around, and a seamless integration between your living and your life in the neighborhood. And so both can be seen as a valuing of community, but it's different kinds of communities that the two are preferencing. Not just where we eat or where we live, but also where we worship. So New York Times did this really interesting study of different religious groups and their political affiliation. And so I took from the list those most divided on the top and on the left and on the bottom. So the most Democratic leaning ones. Maybe you know some Reform Jews. They're very. It's not like Orthodox Jews. It's the Jews who are okay with eating a little bit of shrimp here and there, right? Or Unitarians or whatever it might be. Those are overwhelmingly Democratic. Whereas then there are a number of groups that are overwhelmingly Republican. Interestingly, at the center of the list, there were two groups that were politically diverse, the most politically diverse. And the most politically diverse groups in America are Roman Catholics and Adventists. And so one can think through if perhaps we're set up to be in this unique position to be able to model political diversity and dialogue in our church in the way that maybe some other communities of faith have a more difficult time with. Now, that said, one can still wonder if within our own community of faith, we have partitioned ourselves maybe not into different faith communities, but into different churches or different small groups or different people we sit with at potluck or whatever it might be. And so perhaps even though our denomination as a whole is very diverse, perhaps we still tend to isolate in some ways. There's even impacts on what brands we buy. So I thought this was a really interesting study where it looks at what kind of pest spray you get, or what magazines you read, or what news you watch. We talked about that, where you shop, what cars you buy, all of these things. And you have some brands that are distinctly identified as conservative, and other brands that are distinctly identified as liberal, even though there's nothing on the face of it, perhaps, or why liberals would like women's tennis and conservatives would like pro bull riding. Although I think when you read that, it's like that kind of makes sense, that it connects with the associations we have in our mind. But what I want to suggest, all of these are signals of the idea that political identity is increasingly becoming a mega-identity that encompasses our other identities. So when I think about myself, there are many ways I conceive of myself. I think I conceive of the community I live in. I conceive of my race. I conceive of my religion, who I worship with. I conceive of the brands I buy and the reflection of what my values are. I conceive of where I like to go out to eat. And so there are all these different aspects of who I am. And often these different aspects are in tension with each other. These are called cross-cutting identities. So I might have one aspect of my identity that pulls me one way, but another aspect that pulls me another way. And what's happening is cross-cutting identities are vanishing with the purification of political parties, so that a political identity is becoming the organizing identity that all these other things are beginning to fall under. And I think that's something you should be a little bit concerned about. So this is the last thing I'll point out here. So this is by the author Mason. She's a social scientist, and she makes the point that the social sorting leads to an increased polarization, and to politics moving from just a set of views we might have to a mega identity. She argues if your racial identity and your religious identity and your cultural identity and your geographical identity are all wrapped up with your political party, then if your party loses, it hurts a lot more psychologically. And if your party wins, every part of you has won. One of the effects of this increased social sorting is that when elections occur, they're not just competitions between two parties, they become competitions between racial groups and religious groups, and that kind of thing is extremely dangerous. And so if the wrong candidate wins, it's not just that, well, maybe I won't like tax policy for the next couple of years. It's, no, that's a threat to my very way of life, to my identity, to my values, to perhaps my religion. All of that gets wrapped up in elections. And so that's how we can begin to understand what's going on, that these political identities are becoming totalizing, that they're the mega identities that start to encompass all our other identities. And so how we respond to this? I'm not sure. I think this is a really big challenge, but I want to suggest maybe as Christians, we're given an alternative mega identity, that there's something else all of our identities will be wrapped up into. And I really like this idea of being a peacemaker. I'll let you talk about this a little bit and tease it out in your small groups. Maybe this isn't the best one for you, but I've really come to identify with this term of peacemaker, that whatever my particular economic views or particular social views or particular preferences for whole food or Cracker Barrel or whatever it might be, all of those can be wrapped up within a mega identity of being a peacemaker, and someone who, rather than sees themselves in a competition against the other. This is going back to some of the fear rhetoric, right? A competition for our survival. We're a group who is to bring peace to the world, right? Now, I don't think Peacemaker means that we don't allow room for robust discussions. I don't think Peacemaker means that we don't advocate for important issues of justice or important issues of equality. I don't think that is at all what the term means. But I do think it means we step outside of this conflict narrative that if one party doesn't win or the other, then all is lost. And instead of leaning left or right, we step below, right? The image of foot washing. And so maybe there's something there we can tap into that can help us be liberated from some of the totalization of political identity. That political identity is coming as a mega-identity. Maybe that's something we should resist. Okay, so I'm going to move us into small groups, and here are a couple of questions I want us to discuss in our groups, and then we'll come back and chat about them together. One is, what are some of the biblical principles you find helpful for navigating political polarization? So maybe it's some of the ones I touched on today, maybe some other ones came to mind, some of the particular challenges of our nation becoming increasingly polarized. What are some principles that help us with it? And the second is, how do we avoid having our Christian identity subsumed into a political identity? And we've seen this happen where for many individuals, them being a Christian is just a mandate for them to vote a particular way or support a candidate regardless of that candidate's actions, right? So how might we protect our Christian identity to make sure that it's not just another part of us that's being wrapped up in this super identity or this mega identity of our politics? So I'm going to stop us here and send us into our small groups.